This isn't just a podcast, it's a movement. The Middle Ground Mike is fighting for truth and unity. Subscribe now or support us today. Links are in the notes. Stand with us.
Michigan is heading into the biggest political reset we've seen in years. New governor, new coalitions, and a voter base that's sick of being treated like a meme. And today we're talking about the name you keep hearing, John James. He's run for office in multiple positions in our state, currently a House rep. But he's not just a candidate. He's a test of the Republican Party, of suburban swing voters, and of the exhausted middle that decides this state. Even though people claim red or blue, remember, Michigan is purple. He's got a compelling biography, a real voting record, real election results, and now a real governor polling that shows he's in striking distance. And if it was today, according to polls, he may win. This episode is a preview and a breakdown, pros, cons, receipts, what we think voters care about, and what that can actually mean for unity and how we can get things done in Michigan. Because remember, beyond partisan, it matters what they can get done no matter their party. If you want deeper version, we publish daily articles and breakdowns at buymeacoffee.com/TMGM. It's not necessarily just as a tip jar, but if you can, that's great. But as a place, we like to post receipts, we like to post data, the longer written analysis that you can share. All right, let's get into the John James test. Who is John James? And why is this run different now? He's not considering it. He's in. He announced he's running for governor, and that instantly made him the highest profile Republican. The pro for James is momentum and attention. The cons is the attention turns into scrutiny fast, especially in statewide where he previously lost 2 U.S. Senate races. But, his House seat tells you what kind of candidate he is. Competitive, not safe. He flipped and then held Michigan's 10th congressional district, a suburban swing area. In 2022, he won at 48.3 to 48.8 to 48.3%, about a difference of 1,600 votes. In 2024, he won at 51 to 45%. That's not theoretical. That's proof he can win in a politically mixed region. The pro, he's battle tested. The con, the statewide Michigan is bigger and harsher than a swing district in Detroit/Wayne County. The turnout, college towns, West Michigan, Northern Michigan, 2 different words. He's now got general early election, math working for him, at least on paper. According to a 2025 in November Epic MRA poll, he's at 34%. He's at 37%. Benson's at 33%, and Duggan's at 19%. It's a 3-way field. Looks like he has a really strong chance of winning. It's a warning, though. Race is wide open, and the polarization won't decide it alone. The pro is James starts near the top. The con, that 37% is not governing strength. It's a ceiling unless he expands beyond Republicans. Remember, Representative James, you represent Democrats in this state too if you become governor. And it's about unity, and their concerns matter too. And let's talk about that part a little bit. The same poll reports that 57% of respondents feel forgotten by Democrats or Republicans in Lansing. The middle screaming. It's not ideology. It's alienation by our leaders. The pro for James is he can run as a reformer. The con, he's already tried in certain situations and not won. Because people are going to ask, reform what? And why now? Here's the core pro of John James that I've been able to really dig into. He can win swing territory, and he's proved it. He's built for suburban politics and urban politics, where Michigan elections are won or lost, depending on the city. He's serious. A lot of voters are exhausted. James' style, disciplined, military coded. The adult in the room is a pro with moderates. The con, that's serious, can read distant and out of touch. If he doesn't show empathy on costs and daily pain, remember, that's the number one concern. Think of the 90s, John James. It's the economy, stupid. I'm not calling him stupid. It was just a phrase for you youngins. He can claim a different coalition than the old GOP of Michigan, He has the potential to reframe what the party can be. This pro-coalition expansion. The con is these are authenticity tests. Voters will ask if the coalition is real or is it just marketing. But he has a clear opening. Term limits create a vacuum. Whitmer can't run again. That means the race is a reset for the state of Michigan. Less incumbency gravity, more persuasion. The pro is opportunity. The con is the chaos that this is creating. And with Duggan in there, it's a 3-way dynamic. He lost statewide election twice. Voters remember. James previously lost Senate races in 18 and 20. But that doesn't mean he can't win governor, but it does mean opponents will brand him as always running. The pro is resilience and the name recognition because he does come with a strong presence. The why governor question is unavoidable. You're leaving a competitive House seat to run statewide will be framed as a will, could be framed as ambition. But the pro is leadership aspiration. But the general language loses now. Voters want plan level detail on roads, schools, affordability. Are you going to fix insurance, safety? He can speak on structured priorities, but he's got to be detailed. If it stays abstract, independents will turn out of him and they'll tune him out. But he has to prove he's independence, not just party alignment. That's what Americans want. Michigan's middle doesn't want party robots. James will be pressured to demonstrate Michigan first over party. The pro is he can do it. The con is voting and messaging will be compared to national alignment. But you got to remember, trust isn't just built on the biography, it's built on behavior under pressure. And that's where debates, crisis moments, and direct questions matter. If he dodges, it's going to land as weakness. If he explains, it'll land as strength. And from what I know, he hasn't been in any debates. So again, if you know John James, get him to come on the show. Look at our Chris Swanson interview. We're not here to bash you. We're here to find out how you think and what your process is. He's got a lead, but he's not in control. Independents are the red flag for both parties this cycle. Independents had James at 1% while Mike Duggan led. That means James' persuasion campaign is not optional. It's got to be his entire race. Favorability matters more than just ideology to win your bases. He's got a 37% favorable, 28% unfavorable, with 35% not sure. That's opportunity, but it's also a huge danger. But he's got to define himself, not let the opponents define him. At the Michigan Republican Leadership Conference straw poll, James placed fourth. Ark Nesbitt led with 29, Tom Leonard 23, Mike Cox 18. That's not the general electorate, that's just the activists. But he's not showing up. Storyline is political poison, right? Even fair or unfair. If activists and insiders say you're absent, it becomes a trust issue. The pro is he can out-organize later. The con is name ID only. Doesn't win primaries if the base feels disrespected. Like, he's got to really get out there. He's got to push things. If he wins the primary damaged, the middle ground in Michigan, the middle voters, independents, are going to punish him for that. But this is where unity starts. How you treat your rivals, John James. Where does this go? You got a lot of critics out there. What are you going to do to win over moderate Democrats and independents? That's what matters, because we've got to fix problems. You've got to be able to look at that Democrat who may even have what they like to call the woke agenda, right? We've got to be able to get certain things done in the state with them. Why? Because they live here, they vote here, they're a part of this. What are you going to do to fix that? People want roads fixed. They want the schools improved, insurance costs addressed, housing bills, safety handled without this chaos. But unfortunately, he gets a low environmental score. I believe 2024 is only 6%. People are going to use that against him, especially in suburban, college-educated areas and among younger voters who tend to be pro. But, he can pitch energy, affordability, and reliability. But he may lose some moderates if he's framed as anti-environment. But his Michigan first credibility is going to depend on a lot. Auto industry, interpretations, the manufacturing, the tariffs, which he supported the tariffs. Supply chain. Michigan voters want a governor who understands the economy beyond the campaign lines. The pro is his business and logistics background. He's been very successful. But the voters are going to ask for the receipts. What policies, what partnerships, what measurable targets? Education. He's talked about academic excellence as a top priority. And we've struggled after COVID as a state. Education is cross-party. Look what we got done with the budget. Culture war education has seeped into there too, though. How's he going to manage that? Because that is a very divisional issue. The middle wants trade-offs admitted out loud. We need to know. We deserve to know. We have the right to know. Unity is built when a candidate says, here's the benefit, here's the cost, here's why it's worth it. That's rare. That's something that Mike Duggan did a good job at, whether you like him or not. He did a good job at that. John James, if you want to win, you need to take a page out of that kind of book. Tell us what you're going to do. If you want to get rid of a certain program, how are you going to get us from point A to point B without leaving people in the dust? That's what the voters want to know, because some people depend on these programs. How are you going to make that transition? That's where a lot of politicians seem to miss the mark. The transition, I know that you want to fix the state. Duh. That's why you're claiming you're running for office. All politicians say it, but what's your process? What's your thoughts? If somebody says point A, what's your thought process behind that? That's what matters, because that's what's going to tell us what you're going to do if you win. Anybody can make talking points. I could Google them right now if you want. But the electoral map, let's talk a little bit about that, right? Macomb, Oakland County, the suburbs of the state, even in the other big cities in the state, that's where he seems to have the strongest, but he does struggle in the inner cities, mainly because of his party. Wayne County is going to be the big one where he's got he doesn't have to win Detroit, but he can't get destroyed. He has to aim for respect, outreach, and reduced margins. You have to pay attention to those people that have less. You have to. How are you going to make their lives better? Because if you can make their lives better, it helps everybody else. If you can help the poor, the inner cities, it's going to boost everything for the lower middle class, blah, blah, blah. It's going to go up. We don't need trickle down economics. We need pressure upward economics. Capitalism can do that, John James. Show us how. But independents are center gravity here, right? In a three-way race, because a big thing is that Mike Duggan is really, 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 really impacting these things. He is. Mike Duggan is having such an insane impact. It's not even funny. Let me pull up. So let's pull, we're going to read some of this, but then we're going to go over a couple of the talking points and the cons to them, right? But unity is not just about the vibes. It's about coalition math. The tone is policy now. The middle votes on, does this person feel stable? His style is calm, but if you over nationalize your message, you're going to lose Michigan's middle because you're running for governor. Michigan voters, 70% want things that are affordable. Cost of living is our top concern here. The manufacturing jobs, plants are slowing down, they're closing because EVs are not hitting where they are because the subsidies were, or tax credits, whatever you want to call them, they were not renewed. We're a state deeply tied to manufacturing. What do the tariffs have been pro and bad, right? I mean, I believe who's bringing back General Electric or Whirlpool? One of them's bringing their washing machine manufacturing back to America. But then there's also been things like where it's hit the price pressures, and that's a problem. So how are you going to balance that? How are you going to challenge the president if you need to? You're a Republican, and Major Taylor Greene has kind of proven that if you don't toe the line, he can turn against you. Environmental groups and labor advocates are going to scrutinize specifics, right? Pro jobs. That tends to be an area of criticism there. But, you have to be pro jobs, but you also have to frame things in a way that those pro jobs are going to impact things. Right. So if I'm saying I'm pro environment, if being pro environment eliminates X amount of jobs, it's going to replace X amount of jobs. But how are we going to get the person from these jobs to those jobs? And how are you actually going to make sure it happens beyond the talking point? But let's kind of dig into a little bit more of the nitty gritty here, right? The polls show that the electorate are remaining undecided. Let me see, where is he at? Trying to find, okay, here we go. He's got mixed support in internal GOP polls. The environmental voting record could alienate moderates because he's been a little bit too pro-business in a lot of people's eyes. Remember, only 6%. He's, the voters in this state are citing economic and practical governance concerns above ideological ones. James' campaign must pivot from identity to outcomes. That's where it kind of it has to go that way. Michigan's unemployment rate is now 5.3%. Now I got all my stuff up here, right? We've got an annual average unemployment for 2024 was 4.5%, up from 3.9 in 2023. It's showing softness in the job market about the EVs, right? A rising jobless rate means more families feel economic insecurity, which becomes a major campaign issue and influences swing voters. Our non-farm payroll expanded by about 1% year over year. That's not enough. He has to really go after educating people for the jobs that are out there. My apologies. But he does focus on economic opportunity. He emphasizes bringing manufacturing jobs back here and strengthening our manufacturing here in Michigan. But he does oppose the EV mandates. They risk moving jobs to other states and countries and hurting Michigan's automotive workforce. It has to a point. Look at the facts. That's his energy independence is, again, where it can become an issue. affordability and economic pressures. He highlights the rising prices on essentials, housing, food, energy are key concerns he intends to address by reducing regulatory burdens to help lower costs for families. But we need to know what regulations those are, John. You need to make sure that those regulations don't hurt people. They don't hurt the people. They can't afford to overcome them if they're gone. That's where you have to find it. Or you have to put in different mechanisms to protect people. Voters are going to look for concrete policies, not just rhetoric. A lot of stuff so far is rhetoric. We need more details before the primaries. He's focused publicly more on affordability broadly than the details, especially on healthcare policy, but his congressional votes, he has supported federal budget measures that include cuts to programs sometimes, and it's strong criticism from healthcare advocates here in Michigan. I'm about state control. What are you going to do to make sure the state can take care of its citizens medically? His campaign is positioning themselves as pro-business, advocating for lower taxes, regulations, and making Michigan more attractive for investment and job creation. How does this matter to voters? Business growth and job creation are connected in voter minds to tax and regulatory climates. But it doesn't have to be that way. It can be parallel, but some voters are fearing deregulation could cut back on public services that they care about and that they know people or even themselves need. So, what are you going to do to protect those situations? And don't give a generic statement. Your record shows support of traditional energy and domestic resource production and opposes certain federal environment regulations you see as job killing. Okay, if you see it that way, how can you impact those things with like the CO2 emissions, right? Okay, you want to get rid of certain policies, right? Either the scrubbers, whatever. Okay, how are you going to counter that to help protect people, but also drop that regulation? You answer those questions, you can win, or they could cost you the election. He's opposed drilling limits in the lakes. Social issues. He's identified himself as conservative on social issues, pro-business, pro-Second Amendment, pro-life, with some nuance. For example, he has opposed firing workers over sexual orientation and opposed recreational marijuana legislation. On abortion, he said he would not pursue a national ban, and he has said, quoted, that he wouldn't undo rights established in Michigan law, which reflects an attempt to temper the issues for a statewide race, which is important because the majority here are very pro-choice when it comes to abortion, whether you agree on it or not. That's what the majority of voters in Michigan want. Um, but these social issues still matter strongly, especially things that are considered the woke agenda. How are you going to approach that? A lot of it, to me, some of that stuff is stuff that should be in the home. It shouldn't be the government teaching it, right? But a lot of parents feel differently, and that's their choice. And that stuff has to be done at the local level. But let's get a summary of where he stands, right? According to Representative John James, for running for governor in Michigan, he's going to focus on affordability, job creation, supply chain security. And if you live, like I know downriver Michigan, where I'm from, there's a lot of warehouses, right? So supply chain it impacts us big here. Manufacturing, deregulating certain areas, and trying to create a more pro-business climate. Traditional energy over federal mandates is where he stands. But people are saying this could risk clean energy jobs. Hydrogen. That's where the future is, guys. Emphasis on parent choice and job readiness. He's vague on the healthcare on the governor level, but past votes have drawn criticism. Taxes and regulation, we kind of already talked about that a little bit. But if you're going to cut taxes, how are you going to pay for some of these things that people in the state want? Talk about that. Or can you become more efficient? Talk about that, Representative. Social issues. He's a conservative baseline, but he does have moderate tendencies. These are things, right? So we do know about John James is he's moderate on a lot of issues that seem to come down in the Michigan level. But he is also, let's be very clear, okay? He's still very conservative. And again, that's his prerogative, right? That's who he is. We don't want him to lie to us. But he's not just running for governor. He's forcing Michigan to answer a bigger question. Do we want noise or do we want results? Because the truth is, the state is full of people who don't want a culture war. They want a functioning Michigan. They want roads. They want schools. They want affordability, safety, and jobs. And they want leaders who don't treat their neighbors like enemies. If you want the written breakdowns, data and receipts over the coming weeks and months and the daily articles that go deeper than any of these episodes can, that's at buymeacoffee.com/TMGM. We post there every day because the middle needs a home and we're building it. No left, no right, just forward. Thanks for listening, and check in next week as we're going to look into Secretary of State Benson.